The room went silent. A team of forensic scientists, radiologists, and Egyptologists stood around a computer screen, watching a face slowly take shape, layer by layer, muscle by muscle, skin by skin, until a pair of eyes seemed to look back at them for the first time in over 3,000 years. This was not a statue. This was not a painting on a temple wall. This was the actual face of one of the most powerful human beings who ever lived, rebuilt from the bones of his own skull. And what they saw did not match the myth. It matched a man. For 3,000 years, the world knew Rameses II only through stone. Colossal statues at Abu Simbel, 40 feet tall, carved with a jaw of granite and eyes that stared out over the Nile as if daring time itself to challenge him. Temple reliefs showed him young, muscular, eternally in his prime, smiting enemies with one arm raised and a bow in the other hand. For millennia, that was the only Rameses anyone had ever seen. A god-king frozen in idealized perfection, exactly the way Egyptian art was designed to present a pharaoh, not as he looked, as he wanted to be remembered. But underneath the sand of the Valley of the Kings, a very different Rameses had been waiting. Not a god, a body, an actual human corpse, mummified with extraordinary skill nearly 33 centuries ago, hidden away, moved in secret, buried again, and eventually rediscovered in a way that reads more like a heist than an archaeological find. And when modern science finally got close enough to the body to reconstruct what its owner truly looked like, the result did something no ancient sculptor ever intended. It humanized him. To understand why this reconstruction mattered so much, you first have to understand who Rameses II actually was, because his reputation was not exaggeration for the sake of ego. He ruled Egypt for around 66 to 67 years, one of the longest reigns of any pharaoh in Egyptian history, second only to the semi-legendary Pepi II of the Old Kingdom. He took the throne in his late teens or early 20s, likely around 1279 BC, and he did not stop building, fighting, and expanding until he was nearly 90 years old. To put that in perspective, most people in ancient Egypt were fortunate to see 40. Rameses outlived 12 of his own sons. He fathered somewhere between 80 and 100 children across multiple wives and a large royal harem. By the time he died, the throne would eventually pass to his 13th son, Merneptah, who himself was already an old man. His military career began early, campaigning alongside his father, Seti I, before he ever wore the crown. Once in power, he pushed Egyptian influence deep into the Levant, clashing with the Hittite Empire in a series of wars that culminated in the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BC, one of the largest chariot battles in recorded history. Egyptian temple inscriptions describe it as a total victory. Hittite records tell a very different story, suggesting more of a costly stalemate. Yet, historians today generally agree the truth sits somewhere in between, with Rameses skillfully surviving a battlefield ambush and then using his considerable propaganda machine to sell it back home as a triumph. What followed, though, was historically significant regardless of who truly won the field that day. Roughly 16 years later, Egypt and the Hittites signed a peace treaty, one of the earliest surviving international peace agreements in human history, a copy of which still hangs today in the headquarters of the United Nations as a symbol of diplomacy predating the modern world by thousands of years. The Battle of Kadesh itself is worth understanding in more detail, because it says a great deal about the man behind the myth. Rameses marched north with 4 divisions of troops, each named after an Egyptian god, intending to seize the strategically vital city of Kadesh from Hittite control. Misled by captured spies who were in fact planted by the Hittites, Rameses advanced ahead of his main army with only a fraction of his forces, walking directly into an ambush. Thousands of Hittite chariots struck his exposed division, and for a period the young pharaoh's personal safety, and quite possibly his life, hung in the balance. Egyptian accounts, carved onto temple walls at Abu Simbel, Karnak, and Luxor, describe Rameses rallying his remaining forces and personally leading a counterattack that turned the tide. Hittite records, by contrast, suggest the battle ended closer to a draw, with both sides claiming victory and neither achieving a decisive strategic breakthrough. What is not in dispute is what came afterward. Roughly 16 years later, exhausted by a continuing stalemate, Egypt and the Hittite Empire under King Hattusili III signed a formal peace treaty, inscribed on silver tablets, establishing mutual non-aggression and even a mutual defense pact. It is recognized today as the oldest surviving peace treaty in world history whose complete text has survived, and a reproduction of it hangs in the United Nations headquarters in New York as a symbolic ancestor of modern diplomacy. Beyond the battlefield, Rameses reshaped Egypt physically. He built more temples, monuments, and statues of himself than any pharaoh before or after him. Abu Simbel, carved directly into a mountainside in Nubia, remains one of the most awe-inspiring architectural achievements of the ancient world, engineered so precisely that twice a year, sunlight travels down a 60-meter corridor to illuminate statues of the gods deep inside the mountain, along with Rameses seated among them. He also founded a new capital city, Pi Rameses, in the Nile Delta, transforming it into a major political and military hub. His successors were so influenced by his reign that 9 later pharaohs took the name Rameses in his honor. Ancient Egyptians themselves began referring to him as the great ancestor. There is also a cultural connection that many people recognize, even if they know nothing else about ancient Egypt. Rameses II is widely considered, though not definitively proven, to be the pharaoh referenced in the biblical book of Exodus, the ruler said to have enslaved the Israelites and clashed with Moses. This identification is popular tradition rather than settled historical fact. There is no Egyptian record confirming this specific narrative, and scholars continue to debate the timeline and historical basis of the Exodus story itself. Still, this association is a major reason Rameses II remains one of the most recognized names from ancient Egypt among people who have never studied Egyptology at all. Some scholars point to the biblical mention of a city called Pi Rameses being built by enslaved laborers as circumstantial support for the connection, since Rameses did in fact construct a major delta capital under that name. Others caution that the Exodus narrative was likely compiled and written down centuries after the events it describes, blending oral tradition, later theology, and historical memory in ways that make a precise one-to-one identification of any single pharaoh extremely difficult to confirm through archaeology alone. Egyptian royal records, notably, contain no reference to the plagues, the parting of a sea, or the departure of an enslaved population on the scale described in the biblical account, though the absence of such records is not, by itself, conclusive proof that no such event occurred, since Egyptian monuments were rarely used to record defeats or embarrassments of any kind. The honest answer, and the one most historians give, is that the identification remains a plausible but unproven tradition rather than an established historical. Royal tombs became prime targets for looters, seeking gold, jewelry, and anything of value buried alongside the dead. To protect the remains of Egypt's most revered rulers, priests in later dynasties began quietly moving royal mummies out of their original, heavily looted tombs and consolidating them into secret hiding places. One of these hiding places was a cliffside tomb near Deir el-Bahari, and it held an almost unbelievable collection of Egypt's greatest kings, repositioned and rewrapped by ancient priests trying to protect them from grave robbers who, ironically, they themselves had once been. Rameses II was among them, tucked away alongside Seti I, Thutmose III, and other legendary rulers, hidden from the world for roughly 3,000 years. That hiding place stayed secret until 1881, when Egyptian antiquities officials, following leads from a local family that had been secretly looting from the cache for years, finally located and excavated the tomb. The discovery was staggering. Dozens of royal mummies, kings and queens, whose names appeared only in inscriptions and legend, were suddenly lying in front of archaeologists as physical, tangible bodies. It remains one of the most important mummy discoveries in the history of Egyptology, and Rameses II's body was at the center of it. For decades afterward, his mummy was studied, unwrapped, and eventually placed on display in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Early 20th century researchers, working with the more limited tools of their time, documented obvious physical features, including his long, thin nose, physically similar to the noses seen on statues of his father Seti I, offering early evidence supporting the identification of the mummy as genuinely royal and genuinely his. Then, in the 1970s, the mummy of Rameses II triggered one of the strangest bureaucratic episodes in modern history. Researchers noticed the body was deteriorating. A French physician examining the remains identified a fungal infection actively spreading through the ancient tissue, threatening what had survived for 3 millennia with total decay in a matter of years. The most advanced conservation science available at the time existed in Paris, at the Musée de l'Homme. There was just one obstacle. French law required a valid passport for anyone, alive or dead, entering the country. So, in 1976, the Egyptian government did something almost absurd on paper and unforgettable in practice. They issued Rameses II an official Egyptian passport, listing his occupation as, quite simply, king deceased. The mummy of a man who had ruled Egypt during the Bronze Age was flown to France aboard a military aircraft and received at Le Bourget Airport with a ceremonial welcome, befitting visiting royalty, complete with an honor guard. French television covered the arrival live. Researchers at the Paris laboratory successfully treated the fungal infection using gamma radiation, saving the mummy from what could have been irreversible destruction. The Paris examination also produced one of the first genuinely surprising revelations about what Rameses II actually looked like. Forensic scientist Pierre Fernand Secaldi, examining the remarkably preserved hair still attached to the mummy's scalp, determined that Rameses had fine, wavy hair with reddish coloring, a trait that had likely faded and shifted somewhat due to chemicals used in mummification and the passage of thousands of years, but was still detectable at the root. This detail mattered because red or reddish hair was strongly associated in ancient Egyptian religious belief with the god Set, seen as a chaotic and sometimes hostile deity. Some researchers have pointed out that Rameses' own father, Seti I, carried a name literally meaning follower of Set, adding a layer of interpretive interest to the hair color finding, even though its full cultural significance remains a matter of scholarly discussion rather than settled fact. Decades later, in the early 2000s, science caught up even further. A team led by radiologist Sahar Salim of Cairo University and renowned Egyptologist Zahi Hawass began a systematic project to study Egypt's royal mummies using computed tomography, essentially thousands of X-ray slices combined into a complete three-dimensional model of the body, all without ever unwrapping or physically disturbing the ancient remains. This technique, sometimes described as digitally unwrapping a mummy, allowed researchers to examine bone density, dental condition, evidence of disease, old injuries, and even the internal packing materials used by ancient embalmers, all through a completely non-invasive scan. The scans did more than measure bones. They also exposed the extraordinary skill of the embalmers who prepared his body nearly 33 centuries ago. CT imaging revealed small packets of linen and resin-soaked material placed beneath the skin of his limbs and neck, a technique ancient embalmers used to restore a lifelike, rounded appearance to a body that would otherwise have shrunk and hollowed out during the drying process. Found crossed over his chest in a specific royal pose reserved for kings, and small objects, likely protective amulets, had been placed within the wrappings, consistent with religious practices meant to guide and protect a pharaoh's spirit into the afterlife. None of this required removing a single layer of linen. It was reconstructed entirely from digital data, a level of detail that would have been unimaginable to the very researchers who first examined the mummy by hand in the 19th and 20th centuries. The CT data on Rameses II told a striking story about his final decades of life. He had lived to somewhere around 90 years old, an extraordinary age for anyone in the ancient world, let alone a king carrying the physical demands of decades of military campaigning. His skeleton showed clear evidence of advanced age. Earlier researchers, working from older X-ray images in the 1980s, had proposed that Rameses suffered from ankylosing spondylitis, a serious inflammatory disease that fuses the joints of the spine. But when Salim and Hawass re-examined the remains with far more detailed CT imaging as part of a broader 2014 study covering 13 royal mummies, they found no evidence of the joint erosion or spinal fusion that would confirm that diagnosis. Instead, they identified a different and far more common condition, diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis, a degenerative hardening of spinal ligaments typically seen in people who live to an advanced age. It causes stiffness and a hunched posture, but is generally far less disabling than ankylosing spondylitis. And its presence actually supports historical accounts describing Rameses remaining physically active, even engaging in ceremonial and military duties well into old age. The scans also revealed a man whose dental health had significantly deteriorated, showing marked tooth wear, cavities, and evidence of abscesses that, in the ancient world, could have caused Rameses considerable ongoing pain and even contributed to infection late in his life. His spine had curved with age. His joints showed the wear expected of a man who had lived nearly a century in an era when the average life expectancy was a fraction of that. In other words, the science was quietly dismantling the myth of the eternal, untouchable God-King one data point at a time, revealing instead a genuinely elderly human being who had simply refused to stop ruling. All of this research eventually set the stage for the moment that generated global headlines and, for many people watching, real shock. In the early 2020s, using detailed CT scan data of the actual skull of Rameses II, forensic artist and face lab director Caroline Wilkinson at Liverpool, John Moores University, working alongside Sahar Salim, undertook a full facial reconstruction using techniques borrowed directly from modern criminal forensics, the same kind of methodology used to help identify unidentified remains in police investigations today. The process itself is remarkable in its complexity. Researchers first built a precise, three-dimensional digital model of the skull from the CT scan data. From there, specialists applied average facial muscle and soft tissue depth measurements, appropriate to ancient Egyptian populations, essentially reconstructing the layers of muscle, fat, and skin that would have covered that specific bone structure in life. This is not guesswork or artistic invention. It is the same evidence-based approach used to rebuild the face of England's King Richard III after his remains were rediscovered under a parking lot, and even used in creating a modern reconstruction of the historical figure behind the St. Nicholas legend. This reconstruction also served a scientific purpose beyond simple curiosity. Egyptologists had long debated the exact family relationships among several royal mummies found in the Deir el-Bahari cache and other hidden tombs, since ancient labels and coffin markings were sometimes altered, damaged, or deliberately misleading after centuries of reburials by priests trying to protect the bodies from looters. By comparing skeletal structure, particularly the long, narrow shape of the nose and the set of the jaw, researchers were able to strengthen the case that certain mummies belonged to specific members of the Rameses family line, since these features tend to be inherited and appeared consistently across the remains attributed to Seti I. Rameses, the first version of the reconstruction depicted Rameses as he would have appeared at the actual moment of his death, around 90 years old, complete with sunken cheeks, a hunched profile, and the visible weight of a very long life. Researchers then applied a separate three-dimensional age regression process, essentially reverse aging the model to estimate how the same face would have appeared decades earlier, at around age 45, near what is considered the peak of his reign and physical power. The results stunned even the researchers who built it. Salim herself described the reconstructed face as strikingly handsome, with a pronounced nose and strong jawline consistent with distinctive features documented across the royal family. For millions of people who had only ever pictured Rameses II as an impossibly perfect stone colossus, seeing an approximation of his actual living face, wrinkles, proportions, and all, was a genuinely emotional experience. It closed a 3,000-year gap in an instant. This was not a myth. This was not propaganda carved into a temple wall to intimidate rivals and reassure a nation. This was, as close as modern science can currently get, simply a man. This was not an isolated experiment either. Wilkinson's Face Lab had already earned an international reputation years earlier by reconstructing the face of England's King Richard III from a skeleton discovered beneath a parking lot in Leicester, a project that similarly transformed an abstract historical figure into a recognizable human face and helped confirm the identification of the remains through independent lines of evidence. The same methodology has since been applied to other ancient Egyptian rulers. In 2024, a separate team led by Sahar Salim and Egyptologist Zahi Hawass, working with Brazilian forensic graphics specialist Cicero Moraes, reconstructed the face of Amenhotep I, a pharaoh from the 18th dynasty who ruled roughly 300 years before Rameses and whose mummy had famously never been physically unwrapped by modern researchers, out of deliberate respect for the near-perfect condition in which ancient priests had rewrapped him. That reconstruction, again based entirely on CT scan data, revealed features that differed noticeably from his official statues, including a pronounced overbite rarely depicted in formal royal art, reinforcing a pattern researchers were now seeing across multiple pharaohs. Ancient Egyptian art was never meant to be a photograph. It was meant to be a statement of eternal power, and modern forensic science was, piece by piece, pharaoh by pharaoh, finally separating the propaganda from the person. The reaction online was immediate and enormous. Some viewers were struck by how closely the reconstructed features aligned with the grand statues at Abu Simbel, suggesting that, at least in terms of general structure, ancient sculptors may have captured more genuine likeness than historians once assumed, even while stylizing the body into idealized youth and physical perfection. Others were struck by the opposite reaction, surprised by just how ordinary and human the face appeared once stripped of its royal, divine framing. A pharaoh who ancient propaganda described in godlike terms turned out, unsurprisingly but somehow still shockingly, to have had an aging human face just like anyone else who lived into their 90s. There was also debate, and it deserves to be acknowledged honestly rather than glossed over. As with virtually every facial reconstruction of ancient Egyptian figures, questions and disagreements emerged around skin tone. Forensic facial reconstruction from skull data alone cannot definitively determine skin pigmentation, since skin color depends on soft tissue and genetic factors not preserved in bone. Researchers typically base skin tone estimates on a combination of regional population data, any preserved soft tissue evidence, and reasonable historical context. But this remains one of the more scientifically uncertain aspects of any such reconstruction. And different independent teams working on separate reconstructions of Rameses II, including a parallel project by Brazilian graphics specialist Cicero Moraes, have publicly acknowledged this as an area of ongoing debate rather than settled certainty. Presenting this honestly matters because the goal of forensic reconstruction is scientific approximation, not a definitive, unchallengeable image. What makes this entire story more than just a viral image, though, is what it represents about the growing partnership between archaeology and modern medical technology. A generation ago, studying a royal mummy meant physically unwrapping linen that had protected a body for thousands of years, an invasive and ultimately destructive process. Today, researchers can generate a complete anatomical picture, from bone density and healed injuries to embalming techniques and even estimated cause of death in some cases, without disturbing a single wrapping. The Same CT technology that reconstructed the face of Rameses II has also been used to examine the mummy of King Tutankhamun, revealing details about his health, his family lineage, and long-debated theories about how he died. It has been used to study Amenhotep III and Amenhotep I, in each case peeling back ancient bandages using nothing but computer software, preserving irreplaceable remains for future generations of researchers, while still extracting extraordinary new information from them. There is something quietly profound about that shift. For thousands of years, Rameses II controlled his own image with total authority. Every statue, every temple wall, every inscription was propaganda, in the most literal sense, an eternal and changing performance of power designed specifically to outlast him. And in many ways, it worked exactly as intended. His name endured. His monuments still draw millions of visitors to Egypt every year. But it took modern science, working from the inside of his own skull, to finally show the world something that no ancient artist was ever commissioned to carve. Simply what he actually looked like as an aging human being who ruled for 6.5 decades, buried 12 of his own children, negotiated one of history's earliest peace treaties, and eventually succumbed, like every other person before and after him, to time. Today, the actual mummy of Rameses II no longer sits in the older galleries of the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square, where it rested for much of the 20th century. In 2021, as part of a highly publicized event Egyptian media dubbed the Pharaoh's Golden Parade, the mummy was transported through the streets of Cairo in a specially designed, climate-controlled vehicle, accompanied by a full ceremonial procession, to its new, permanent home at the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. It was, in its own strange way, an echo of the 1976 flight to Paris, another moment where a 3,000-year-old king was moved through a modern city while crowds gathered to watch, a ruler who, quite remarkably, still commands public spectacle in the 21st century the same way he once did in his own lifetime. That is ultimately what made this reconstruction so shocking to so many people, not some hidden secret or scandalous discovery, but something far more universal. Rameses II spent his entire reign building an image of himself as eternal, untouchable, and divine. Modern forensic science, quietly and methodically, gave the world back his humanity instead. If you found this as fascinating as we did, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because we cover stories just like this one every week, where science and history collide to reveal truths that have been buried for thousands of years. Drop a comment below and let us know which ancient figure you would want scientists to reconstruct next. And if you want more deep dives into the secrets hidden inside history's greatest mysteries, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.